welcome to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's live video series. And joining me today to share the stories behind the 10 best books that influenced him the most on his life path is award-winning science writer, researcher, and author Dawson Church. For those of you who may not be familiar with Dawson's work, he writes the kind of books that get me excited. He has 2 bestsellers under his belt, The Genie in Your Genes, which was the first book to demonstrate that emotions drive gene expression, and Mind to Matter, which showed that the brain creates much of what we think of as objective reality. He also has a new book coming out later this year called Bliss Brain, which demonstrates that peak mental states rapidly remodel the brain for happiness. Can't wait to read that one. And in addition to conducting dozens of clinical trials, Dawson has founded the National Institute for Integrative Healthcare at NIIH.org to promote groundbreaking new treatments. And he shares how to apply the breakthroughs of energy psychology to health and personal performance through EFT Universe, which is one of my favorite sites. It's also one of the largest alternative medicine sites on the web. So if you haven't seen it, do check it out. And there's a lot more to him than that, but I think that's enough to give us some insight into what Dawson Church is all about. So if you have questions for Dawson, feel free to post them in the chat window as we go along, and we'll address them before the end of this session. And now, Dawson, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
What a pleasure it is, and what a wonderful project this is as well. I so love hearing what other authors have been inspired by and how they became the people they are. And so that gives us a chance to really get an insight into what made their minds the way they are, the people the way they are. So it's just a fabulous service you offer here. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you. And I love it because who better, you know, to share the books and the teachers and the speakers and the authors that we admire. We all want to know what you've been reading so that we can read it too. Maybe we'll get as smart as you are.
Well, you know, I'm actually not that smart. I'm not that high in IQ, honestly, but I meditate every day. And if you researchers now, there are a few studies showing that when you meditate, that of course, you feel much better, your inner state changes, but after a while, your traits change. In Mind to Matter, I have this, in chapter 1, I have the story of a guy called Graham Phillips, who went on an 8-week mindfulness journey, decided to learn mindfulness, but he was a TV reporter. So this camera crew followed him into this major research lab at Monash University, where they filmed him getting MRIs and EEGs and all these tests of his physiological markers. And then he did 8 weeks of meditation. And in 8 weeks, the part of his brain that governs emotional regulation grew by 22.8%. In 8 weeks, that part of this little C-shaped sliver of tissue in the middle of the brain called the dentate gyrus. The dentate gyrus grew by 22.8% in only 2 months. That's how fast our brains are remodeling themselves. And so those feel-good states like meditation, acupressure, grounding, yoga, qigong, all the things I talk about in Mind to Matter, they aren't just making you feel better, they're changing your brain and they're actually making you a lot smarter. So to circle back here, the research is showing that you gain more than 10 IQ points when you're a serious long-term meditator. You become happier and you become smarter. And I read my own books sometimes, Sandra, and I think, wow.
Who wrote that?
Who wrote that? Because I'm meditating usually 2 to 4 hours before I type the first word.
Yeah. Wow. And I know the last time you and I had a conversation, I was telling you that, you know, I've tried meditation for years and I've got that monkey brain. And you said, hey, try my eco meditation. And I did. And it worked. And I still use it. So thank you for that. We will come back to that later because I know that one of your books is about meditation. But we'll get to that one in due course. First, I want to ask you 2 questions. What do books mean to you?
Books mean a lot to me. When I was growing up, books were a religion. And this is in the 1960s and the 1970s, and partly in England. My father was a missionary, so we traveled all different parts of the world, mostly Southern Africa. And so books were precious. Books were the repository of the world's knowledge. And so I like would never, for example, underline anything in a book. Now, very occasionally I get a pencil and underline something very lightly that I could erase afterwards, but you treated books with reverence. And so I wound up, by the time I was in my 50s, with actually a collection of several, maybe a couple of thousand antique books. And I loved antique books, I loved modern books, and then I was intrigued to see the movement of knowledge online. But growing up, you treated books with reverence, and they were precious. Now, I have to say, I don't have a book handy I can grab right from where I'm sitting right now. But if you look at my books now, you'll see that I have lost those old habits. My books are dog-eared, they're highlighted, they're marked up. I want to be able to find a piece of information in a book really fast, and that's my way of doing it. So that I consider it a great compliment as an author when someone walks up to me at a signing and they have a pockmarked, pitted, scarred, coffee stained
Yeah.
book, because they've really interacted with that book. That's my goal, is I want these books to change people's lives. I put huge amounts of time into writing and revising them, and I want to interact and have an interactive conversation with the author in that book. So nowadays, you look at my library, the books I'm really into, they're just really, I work with those books.
Yeah. So, well, the second question then, if you've got thousands, how easy or difficult was it for you to come up with 10?
Hard. It was quite hard to come up with 10. And I've since actually wanted to add an 11th, and it's not really a book, it's more like a long poem, but it's the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. I've really been getting into those and meditating on those every night. I have never been an evening meditator, but I've now been so absorbed in, you just read one sutra of Patanjali. So those have really affected me. And then one of the books on my list is the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, and he was a Roman emperor, and he wrote down his code, his code of being, things he thought were important. Never designed them for publication. They weren't for public consumption. Just Marcus Aurelius writing down his philosophy. But it's timeless, and you realize there were these great people in 100 AD. There were these great people in 5000 BC. There were these people throughout history, and we're all wrestling with the same problems. How do you become happy? How do you become? How are you a good person? Are you automatically good? Do you struggle with being good? Do you struggle with moral decisions? Do you struggle with there are common archetypal themes? And so to read a 2,000-year-old book like that, The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, and realize that these are timeless human questions. We all face them, and we will face them in 1,000 years and 2,000 years, and they'll be equally relevant then. So I picked them because they'd had a real impact on me for one reason or another.
Yeah, I was looking, I usually get notes together about the books, and I saw that this one, it says it's as relevant today to those in power struggles over empires and boardrooms as it was when it was first recorded. More so, I would think, if we're talking about power struggles and boardrooms, given everything that's going on today. But yes, that is one that I've heard a few people speak about. It really does seem to touch people.
It does. And another one that I want to just really recommend strongly is by a close friend of mine called Jack Canfield, and is best known as the co-author of the Chicken Soup series. But his major book, I think it came out in 2000, is called The Success Principles. And then the anniversary edition of the book just came out. And it's called The Success Principles. And this is the book I wish I had had when I was 20. And it took me a long time to find myself. I began to kind of find myself and move on to my current path when I was 45 years old, almost 20 years ago. So it's interesting that for me, I joined a spiritual community when I was 15 years old, trying to escape my suffering. I mean, I joked about social distancing, like, now we're supposed to with the pandemic and the crash we've had, you're supposed to stay 6 feet away from people around you. And I joke sometimes that when I was like 12, 14, 15 years old, people stayed about 6 feet away from me or further because I was so toxically depressed and anxious and stressed that basically people couldn't stand being around me. People avoided me because I was so miserable, and almost everyone I knew was miserable as well. They were almost all clergy. They were in the church. They'd gone to the clergy. They'd gone to religion to try and escape their misery. Hadn't really worked, so I got into psychology more than religion. But when I was 15, I joined a spiritual community, and I struggled. I struggled for the next 15 years. I had so many uh, upsets, disappointments. I lived a life of, that great line of the poet, a life of most men live lives of quiet desperation.
Yes.
And I alternated between loud desperation and quiet desperation. That's my two states. But both of them were just desperation. And I couldn't even really imagine being a happy person. I used to think those people who seem happy, they aren't really happy. They're just faking it. Because I couldn't really imagine being happy. If anyone had told me that 40 years later, I'd be writing a book called Bliss Brain, I would have thought they were deluded. Never in 100 lifetimes would I might get a little bit less unhappy. That was my goal. So I went through those stages. And the reason I love Jack's book, The Success Principle, so much is that if someone had handed me that book, and I've handed this book now to people who are struggling and said, read this book. And I've given it to young people. I've given it to my children, and I'll give it to my grandchildren as well when they're like 15 or so, 12. And what Jack did there, Jack interviewed hundreds of the world's most successful people, and he boiled their wisdom down into 64 principles. And they're mostly 2, 3, or 5 pages long. They're not very long, but they are incredibly important. So it's Marcus Aurelius, but really for the 21st century. And it's the instructions from the world's most successful people as to how to be successful. And you can figure that out for yourself. You can figure out how to be successful in terms of impact or money or relationships or career. And you can stumble along and try to figure it out yourself. But a friend of mine used the analogy of a dark night and a city. He said, if I go to a city and the power's out, there are no street lamps, I have no GPS, I have no way of finding my way around, and I try to find my way to a destination in that city, it's hard. But if I have a GPS and it's brightly lit and there are street signs, it's really easy. And so people who've learned to navigate and locate these principles of success, it is much easier to read about their principles. You buy a book that costs $20 and you get $1 million of ideas from that book. And here you have Jack Canfield, one of the most successful people in the world, interviewing the other successful people in the world, and you spend $20 and they tell you how to be successful. If that book cost $10,000, I'd say buy it immediately.
If you don't mind me asking, what was it that turned started that journey away from being toxic, from being depressed, from being the kind of person that others wanted to avoid? What happened?
It happened in stages, and it happened very slowly. So I began taking psychology courses by mail order back then when I was still in high school. And then I never did get a degree in psychology, but my first degree was in mass communications. But I began to try and find answers from spirituality, from psychology. And I could see there were people who were happier than I was. I began to kind of mimic what they would do. And so I began to change slowly. And then I made this crucial choice one day. I learned to meditate when I was 15, but as you say, meditation is really hard. You sit down and close your eyes. In my new book, Bliss Brain, I talk about the default mode network. And the default mode network is 2 pieces of neural tissue. One right behind your eyebrows here is the mid-prefrontal cortex. The other is right over here in the back of your head, and it's called the posterior cingulate cortex. And one piece of tissue here, one piece of tissue here, the default mode network. And that's called the default mode network because your brain defaults to that when it's not doing anything. So when you're doing stuff, anything, when I'm refilling my water bottle, when I'm composing an email, when I'm reading, when I am engaged in a conversation, anything I'm doing, other parts of the brain are active called the task positive network. But when I'm not doing a task, the task positive network isn't being used, and so the brain uses those resources then and activates the default mode network. And so we default to this state of these two brain regions being active. And what do those two brain regions do? What I wish the default mode network was designed to do was make us happy and make us count our blessings and feel grateful and compassionate for everything in the world. And unfortunately, the default mode network does the exact opposite. The default mode network is obsessed with me. It's obsessed with my worries, my complaints, my past history, what hurt me, what didn't work for me in my life in the past. And when it's got done agonizing and parading all the bad stuff of your past, it then cheerfully hops to the future and says, now look how that bad thing might happen again in the future. So our default state of our brains is anxious and depressed and worried. And so the only way you can shut it down is well, actually I won't go to the brain anatomy of this because it's complicated, and I do go through this in Bliss Brain, but there is a way of shutting it down, and meditators are able to do that. They can silence the default mode network. And the meditation that you learned and that I've been teaching people now for the last 10 years is, does a very neat trick. We've now done MRI studies to show this. But because when people close their eyes and try and meditate, they default to thinking about the past and the future and worrying. The eco-meditation technique keeps the task positive network a little bit active, just enough so the default mode network doesn't turn on. And that's why you can meditate effectively with that method. And so at 45 years old, I began to meditate. I realized, I had a coach then, she said, do you meditate? I said, I don't have time. And as I said that to her, I realized that is what I most need to do. So the next morning, I set my alarm for 5:30 a.m. and I got up an hour earlier. Actually, I set it for 6:30 a.m. I now get up at about 5 or 5:30 naturally, but back then I set it for before my kids got up, and I began to meditate. And then my life began to change a little bit faster. So therapy had helped to change a little bit for 20 years. Then meditation made it change quite a bit faster. Remember in my book, Mind to Matter, that guy, Graham Phillips, who's in 8 weeks, his dentate gyrus, that part of the brain that regulates emotion, in other words, it makes you not be unhappy, that when you're having that negative thought says, pipe down, default mode network, that's not me, not my choice. That part of his brain, that hardware, that anatomical structure in his brain grew 22.8%. Now think about the implications of being able to grow your emotional regulation hardware. This is like the stuff, this is the neural bundles in your brain by over 20% in 8 weeks. Do it for 18 weeks, 18 months, 10 years, and you're really good at emotional regulation. And then you start becoming much, much, much happier. So it became a meditation for me. Then I learned EFT acupressure tapping, which I've written a lot about as well, talk about that in my books, and became much happier really quickly. Learned to laugh. At that point, I was trapped in a marriage where even though I was with a wonderful person, she didn't appreciate or like me being happy. So I had to kind of stay small and stay kind of sad to not trigger her. Didn't like me laughing. Suddenly I began laughing. I began finding my joy, finding my happiness, and my life just changed really quickly after that point. I changed my career, money changed, relationships changed, relationships with my children changed. That was the pivot point in my life, is that day I said, I'm going to set my alarm for 6:30 tomorrow morning, and I am going to meditate every single day.
Yeah, yeah. And I bet your health changed too.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's interesting because number 3 on your list is The Journey of Awakening by Ram Dass, which is also a meditator's guidebook.
Yes.
So what do you like about that particular book?
I took a class which that was one of the textbooks, and I actually got ordained at one point back along the road as a New Thought minister. And one of the classes I took was using that book by Ram Dass as a textbook. And it's a wonderful guide to meditation and the hows and whys of meditation. And so I think that at that early stage, even though this was even before, this is probably 10 years before I made that commitment to daily meditation, I did take that class at a Unity Church. I read the book, and all of this was laying the groundwork for meditative practice. So when I finally made the commitment, then I knew what to do. And so that got me on the path.
So book number 4 is quite different, is Tony Robbins' Unshakable, your financial freedom playbook.
I really, I saw Tony Robbins did his Firewalk in New York City in 1984. And for years, I had a t-shirt, like 30 years, I had a t-shirt that said I did the Firewalk with Tony Robbins. And then when you go to high school and when you go to college, no one teaches you about money. People will say, well, you need to save, you need to pay yourself first. They'll say these vague things about money. You need to be diversified. Really? You need to be diversified? Do you need to be diversified? Is that true? It's a common mantra. The people say, well, I don't know about money. I just hire a money manager to do it for me. Have you looked at how much money you make every year with a money manager managing your account? If your money's in a CD, you're making under 2% right now. If you're in a mutual fund, you've been making, maybe 3 or 4% a year, maybe even less, maybe 1% a year. Most people are financially illiterate. And Tony, in his 2 books on money, has given you, it's like the success principles of Jack Canfield's for money. You read those 2 books of Tony's, and you will get the investment wisdom of the world's very best minds. Ray Dalio, Paul Tudor Jones, all of these people, they're feeding in their best advice into Tony and his book. And Tony is committed to making this available to people. Again, for $20, you're getting investment advice that I can tell you the super rich are happy to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for. And every one of us deserves to be financially secure, and becoming smart about money is a big part of it. I would also throw in a word here about EFT tapping. There's a lot of fear around money, irrational fear around money. In fact, this weekend I'm teaching a weekend course called Tapping Money Miracles. I'm teaching people about money. It's a virtual online course because they don't even read the books. The books, they're on their bookshelf gathering dust because they have all this fear about even approaching the subject. You have to use EFT, release all of that stuff first, then you go forward into education, educating yourself about money, and then you will find that that research shows that individual investors, ordinary people with very routine jobs, are actually, if they're managing their own money, they are usually doing better on average than hedge fund managers and those professionals. They're doing even better if managing their own money. So you need to get financially literate. You didn't get that course in high school or college. You need to give yourself a financial education. I spent tens of thousands of dollars going to investment classes. I could have saved myself the money if Tony's books were available. They weren't back then, but now again, for a few bucks, you're getting literally what the wealthiest people in the world pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for, the world's best financial advice.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, we're not taught parenting, we're not taught about relationships, and we're not taught about money. The things we need for life, to go through life, and we're just not taught them. History, geography, everything else but that. Yeah. Talking about relationships, number 5 is The Energies of Love, Invisible Keys to a Fulfilling Relationship. Donna Eden and David Feinstein.
People suffer, Sandra, and they suffer in various ways. They suffer as a result of their unruly minds, and they suffer as a result of financial ups and downs. They suffer as a result of past trauma. And what we tend to do is we reenact the traumas of our childhood in our adult relationships. And so many people wind up, like in the Money Miracles workshop I'm teaching, I talk about how we have a family money story. We have our father and our mother and our grandfather and our great-grandfather, your money story. What was your money story? We tend to reenact that. Just the same way we reenact our relationship story. When you were growing up, when your brain was being formed, in fact, especially in the first 2 years of life, the fastest growing brain region is the limbic system, the emotional midbrain. And you're seeing people, and you're seeing your father, your mother, your caregivers, people around you, people in your family, extended family, and they're doing a relationship. Mostly they're doing it really badly, and they're doing it blindly. And so you're learning this not as you're learning geography or history when you're in 5th grade. You're learning it neurologically. It's becoming embedded in your emotional midbrain, your limbic system, as neural circuits. And you don't even know it's there. It's just automatic at that point. You're learning their money beliefs. You're learning their beliefs about other people, about other societies. You're learning about how they see the world, all of their worldviews. You're a little sponge taking this in. If you look at brain development, in Mind to Matter, I talk about the brain waves that we go through. And essentially, our normal waking brain wave is beta. But below that, if you meditate, you're going to drop into alpha. If you are asleep, in deep sleep, you're in delta, the slowest wave. When you're dreaming in rapid eye movement sleep, you're in theta. And then occasionally you have flashes of this, what I call the genius wave of gamma, the very top of the range here. But all through sleep, you're in delta and theta. All this activity calms down in beta and alpha. The whole time you're sleeping, you're mostly in delta, a little bit in theta during periods of rapid eye movement and dreaming. And what other states are characteristic of theta and delta? Well, superlearning. If you're in a superlearning state, you're in theta and delta. If you're in a trance, if you get hypnotized and go into a trance, or if you go to a religious ceremony and go into a trance, then all of those high frequencies go away, and you're in those 2 low frequency sleep brain waves, superlearning brain waves of theta and delta. Till the age of 5 years old, your brain is in theta and delta only. No alpha, no beta, no gamma. And you essentially, up till 5, are in a super learning trance. You are sucking in all this information from the outside world, and you are learning language. That's why kids can learn. There are kids who grew up in villages where there are 8 languages being spoken, and they learn all 8 before the age of 5 because they're in this super learning trance up to that point. So you're learning all this stuff about relationships, and most of that learning is utterly dysfunctional. And so you then think, well, I'll find the love of my life when I'm 20 years old, and it'll all be fine. And all you do is you reenact the traumas and the dysfunctionality of the past. You project that forward into the present and play it out there. And so we need to learn to overcome those hurdles. And I've written a book called EFT for Love Relationships. And then my friend, David Feinstein and Don Eden, they were writing The Energies of Love in parallel with that. And I will tell you honestly, their book is infinitely more beautiful than mine. My book is very focused on, let's just do some EFT tapping, let's tap away the trauma. Their book is all about how to use energy work to support your relationships. It is lyrically written, it's beautifully written, and it is so well done. So it teaches you energy tools for releasing those old patterns and then really having a high quality energy relationship. Yesterday, for example, I had a really bad day with one particular person I worked with, and I just could feel my energy was off. So did I send out emails? Did I schedule a phone call? No, none of the above. I went and fixed my energy first. Then I took action on the material level. And Mind to Matter is all about this. Mind to Matter is all about how change your energy and your life changes. Yeah. And Energies of Love by Donna Eden and David Feinstein. It is a gorgeous book on creating a beautiful energy relationship. And when you do that first, then the material relationship is going to follow, just like Mind to Matter.
Yeah, I could just see it on an endorsement on their book. I like your book better than my own. Great endorsement, yeah. Number 6, Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker. And this one says it's the subtitle is The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism and Progress. And I think this was also a New York Times notable book of 2018, one of the Economist's books of the year. So interesting. Tell us about this book.
What I love about this book is that one thing, it's science-based, and you hear a lot of points of view. People have an opinion about how to lose weight. People have an opinion about how to exercise best. People have an opinion about the virus, this, that, and the next thing. People have an opinion about various facets of human behavior. And so what I do when I hear all these opinions, many of them not agreeing with each other, is I go to science and say, what does the science say about this? And that's what Steven Pinker does about our modern world. He goes to the science. And he, I don't know how many studies are reviewed in the book, well over 1,000. And it's a big, thick book, and it looks daunting at first, but it's actually a very enjoyable read. And I listen to it actually on audiobook format myself. And it makes the case for science and reason, which tell us that the world is getting better at a really rapid pace. Now, right now, in the middle of a pandemic and about the economic crash, it's hard to think about that. But we are getting better at a much better pace. Just a few of the statistics he quotes, which I use in my new book, Bliss Brain. And I had to just pick like 20 of them for the book. But literacy, especially women's literacy, has risen dramatically, just exponentially over the last 50 years. I mean, so women's literacy has risen enormously. The percentage of women who die in childbirth has been falling precipitously. The number of babies who die in childbirth. Now, when I say something like there are 5 million babies die in childbirth every year, that sounds terrible. But if you knew that in 1950, 18 million babies died in childbirth, it puts it in perspective. And that's what Pinker does. He contrasts things and shows human rights. Are there human rights abuses? Are there civil wars raging in different parts of the world and people getting killed and butchered? And absolutely. But look at the graph historically over the last 70 years. Human rights have been improving. One statistic that is totally amazing to people is fewer people died in wars, both civilian and military people, in other words, civilians killed in wars and soldiers killed in combat, okay, in the 20th century than in the 19th, proportional to the population. And that includes World War I and World War II. We have these 2 world wars in the 20th century. And despite the 2 world wars, when you go back to the 19th century with the Franco-Prussian War and the American Civil War and the war between the British and the French, far more people died proportionately in the 19th century than in the 20th, and more people died in the 18th than the 19th, and more people died proportionally in the 17th than the 18th. And so historically, the number of people dying of war is diminishing century by century, and has been doing this for some time. Wars between great powers in 1500 were continuous. There was not a year in 1500 where there was not one war happening between great powers somewhere in the world, often multiple wars at the same time. Wars in by the time that 2045 rolls around, will have been a century without a great power war, unprecedented in human history. Poverty. I ask people I do this pop quiz on some of my calls. What do you think of how's the poverty rate changed in America over the last 50 years? And some people say, well, I can just tell there are more homeless people now. It's gone up probably 20%. And other people say, well, maybe it's gone down a little bit, maybe 10%. In terms of what you can buy, poverty is down in the US in the last 50 years by 90%, 90%. it's down by other measures by 50%. But by purchasing, what do you actually buy? What stuff you can get for your money? It's down 90% since 1950. I mean, all of these measures that you look at, oh, global wealth, global longevity. People live twice as long today as they live, this is across the board, across the world, in 1900. In the last, between 1990 and today, there are almost 2 billion people, billion with a B, who've escaped poverty, who are no longer living in poverty. The number of people living in poverty in the world has improved by almost 2 billion. Not 2 million, 2 billion. I mean, it's astonishing how the graph of human flourishing on every single measure is improving. Now, are there still problems? Absolutely. Is global warming going to, maybe wipe out many of our gains? Definitely. I mean, there are all kinds of problems we're dealing with. Weaponized artificial intelligence. I'm not a Pollyanna saying that everything's just great with the world. I mean, there are all of these fake political ads and all the fake news. I mean, there's definitely real problems there. But Steven Pinker paints that in a grand historical suite going back 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, and shows that by every measure of key measure of human flourishing, we're in a much better world than we were in even 20 years ago, let alone 50 years ago, certainly 100 years ago.
Do you think that, are you aware that he's been interviewed in the last couple of months while we've had this situation going? Because I could imagine that a lot of people would like to know, how is this changing that picture?
Well, how this is changing that picture, I think, this is just my own personal view, because honestly, Sandra, the situation is changing so fast that today's predictions are tomorrow's misguided either pessimism or optimism. So today is no guide to tomorrow, and it's really interesting living in these uncertain times. But it looks to me, I mean, my prediction is that this year we'll see global GDP shrink. I mean, it's not, that doesn't take a genius to say that, but I think it's going to shrink by, my prediction will be more than 10% and less than 20%. Now that's a big contraction. However you look at it, global GDP has been growing at 4 or 5% a year. Suddenly we're dropping. But even if we drop 20% for the year, which is unlikely, I mean, that's the extreme end of the range, say we're at 15%, that's going to take us a few years to make up, maybe 3, 4, 5, 7 years to make up. So we're going in for a trough, but we've been in a period of expansion for a while. And the reset is also giving us pause to think about things like carbon emissions. We're realizing that the oceans and the forests is saying, Mother Nature just sent human beings on a big timeout to their rooms.
Yes.
For 3 months, and we're, thank goodness, now that the grass is growing again and the rivers are less polluted, and there aren't all these ocean liners and
well, if we change our definitions of what makes us happy, yeah, I think that we may well emerge from this with a lot of positives.
I think so.
Book number 7, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind by Yuval Harari, renowned historian, and he's writing about humanity's creation and evolution that explores the ways in which biology and history have defined us and our understanding of what it means to be human.
Yeah, and another meditator, he meditates, I've heard, for about 2 hours every day. So, and he writes these genius books like Sapiens, has written others as well, all worth taking in. And the whole way we got to be how we are, I have a chart based on his work in my new book, Bliss Brain, showing the cranial capacity of hominids over the last 4 million years. And since we learned to use tools, probably 3 or 4 million years ago, our brains have tripled in their capacity. The act of using tools led to much more complex thought, and then motor skills, and then complex societies. And so I show on this graph how, if you just look at the record, it's a very simplified graph of time, versus cubic capacity of the brains of hominids, it's been growing extremely quickly. So we are, of course, Homo sapiens sapiens, the wise ape, the upright wise ape, and we can do all these things with our imaginations that species that don't have this cranial capacity cannot do. So if you look at the head of a dog or a cat, for example, my favorite example. So if you look at them, you'll see their nose and their mouth and their eyebrows. They're all, a lot like mine. But then if you're stroking the head of your dog or cat, there's a flat line on top of their skull between their eyebrow and their ear over here. They don't have all the stuff you've got up here in your head. And you can use that neocortex. It's called the neocortex, the new part of the brain, the neocortex. You can use the neocortex to write poetry. You can use it to decide to do good for other people. You can use it for compassion. In one study we just finished, not published yet, but part of the neocortex called the insula lights up in people doing eco meditation as they feel compassion. So we can feel conscious compassion, even for people we don't like. We can do all of these things, all of these wonderfully creative things, art, music, poetry, abstract thinking, mathematics. All of those things we can do because of the neocortex. And he talks about the development of the neocortex in an evolutionary sense, what it's meant in terms of human history, and the complexity of our societies, and our social complexity actually in turn spurred the growth of our brains. We have special neurons in our brains called von Economo neurons, and almost no other species has these neurons. Only highly social species like dolphins, chimpanzees, elephants have von Economo neurons because we're able to think in terms of tribe. We're able to think in terms of more than me. We aren't totally self-absorbed. And so our brains, what allows us to do that. And so how we use our wisdom, and then where we will take our wisdom from here onward, we're clearly thinking much more now about the planet. We're thinking about not just what will work for humankind, we're realizing humankind cannot flourish on a toxic planet. And Darwin, one of the quotes in Bliss Brain, I talk about Charles Darwin and about his talked about as the originator of this term called survival of the fittest. And he never used the term survival of the fittest. He never used it in his books. Herbert Spencer, one of his contemporaries, first used the term survival of the fittest. Darwin said the survival, the well-being of the species in the context of its environment. Darwin knew that we flourish, we human beings flourish in the context of a flourishing world. And so Sapiens, the book by Yuval Harari, is really reminding us at the end that we survive, we turn our sapient ability into the survival, not of our own little pocket of the world, of just human beings, of our species. The whole planet has to be thriving for us to thrive.
Yeah, and I think we're getting a good lesson in that right now, as we're seeing, all of the, the toxins disappear, the ozone layer improving, etc. Yeah, very timely reminder that amongst all the challenges and the problems. So I'm glad that's happening. So number 8, Personal Mythology, The Psychology of Your Evolving Self by David Feinstein. Now that was published in 88. When did you read it?
I read it in 2005, and it really harks back to the work of Joseph Campbell and the Hero's Journey. And David's a very close friend of mine, and he's also the author of The Energies of Love, and also author of another book called The Ethics Handbook for Energy Healers, which we use in our online training, because we have a big certification program certifying people in EFT. And so we use David's work a lot, Personal Mythology, the ethics book, and the whole idea that you have these old dysfunctional stories about who you are and how you are. Like in my book, Mind to Matter, I tell this, one of my myths when I was growing up was, I knew when I was 20, 30 years old that I was a terrible artist. I was no good at drawing. I was no good at math, because people had told me for years I was no good at math. And so when I was taking math classes in high school, the teacher, his name is Miss K, she divided the math class into 3 groups. And in the very front row were all the bright students that were good at math. In the back row were all the bad students who were terrible at math. And the others were in the middle. So she sort of had this segregation in her class, good in the front, bad in the back, all the others were in the middle. So guess where I was in that math class?
Probably sitting right next to me.
Well, I was actually sitting next to another boy called Jean. This is his first name. I hope I one day can catch up with John again. His first name was John, his last name was Barnard. And Miss K reserved a special section for us behind the back row. So me and John Barnard, the two of us, sat there behind the bad students. We were like not even worth her time. Now, so I knew that I never knew from very early age I was failing at math, doing very, very poorly at math. Couldn't draw, so I knew I couldn't draw, couldn't do math. And today I'm the editor of a peer-reviewed journal. I'm the author of several scientific meta-analyses. And when I peer review scientific papers for other journals, I critique the math of scholars. I'm good enough to do that. Okay, I just had the personal myth that I was bad at math. I had the personal myth that I was bad at painting, drawing, and art, and so I believed that my whole life. And suddenly, at the age of 45, after I began meditating, I decided to pick up a watercolor brush one day, and I realized I was doing something really interesting. So I took a one-day watercolor class, began doing watercolors, took a 2-day class, did 8 watercolors, and showed them to a gallery owner and got invited to do a one-man show. And then after that, got invited to do a one-man show at City Hall, this really prestigious venue in Sonoma County where I live. And this other artist walked in and said, gee, I've been doing ceramic art for 30 years and I've never had a one-man show. How did you do that? And I thought, I did it by not knowing it was hard to get a one-man show. I thought it was just something that happened. So this myth, I had these beliefs. I mean, all of these beliefs about I'm too short, I'm too small, I'm too fat, I'm too thin, people in my family can't do this, I'm too traumatized, I blah, 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 blah. The default mode network will give us all these reasons to stay small and broke and confused. And so that's our personal mythology. What David does in his book is he says, your old myths are dysfunctional, they're keeping you stuck. And here's how to build a new myth. Build the new myth in the energy field, your own energy field. So he shows you how to identify those old myths, those old archetypes. Now, Carl Jung talked about 3 archetypes, but there are actually dozens of archetypes. And there's the archetype of the martyr. We all know people who are the martyrs. We all know people who are the extroverts, the archetype of the extrovert, the archetype of the warrior, the archetype of the merchant, the archetype of the mother. These are potent, powerful archetypes, and they may have long since passed their expiration date in your life. You might be living them out, and so personal mythology is this just luscious process for taking a brutally hard look at your archetypes and then questioning them and building functional new ones that'll see you into the future rather than endlessly repeating the ones of your past.
Yeah. We all have our stories, as you say, and they're a limit in us regardless. Yeah. Number 9, Love is a Secret, The Mystic Quest for Divine Love by Andrew Vidici. Now, when I was looking up this one, I saw a review. Somebody had written, perhaps the most advanced book on spirituality by a person who is not himself an adept. So tell us about this one.
Well, I've known Andrew Vidic, the author of that book, for at this point 40 years. And he is one of the most inspiring people I've ever met. And I've seen him through ups and downs. He used to have a business in New York where I used to live. And, he went through some hard times there. He went through hard times I don't want to go into any personal details, but I've seen him, going through all the usual stuff we all go through in our lives with money and relationships and so on. And he is his spiritual orientation, I've never seen it waver a millimeter in either direction. He has been completely on his path. I talked to his wife, and she said, we've been married for, I think they're maybe 45 years. She said, never one day have I woken up in the morning and is there in bed with me. He's never missed a day of meditation. And this guy, you meet him, you talk to him. People just walk up into his presence and they can feel they are in the presence of somebody who is channeling this just pure grace, pure love. And so in Love is a Secret, he talks about the 10 stages of the spiritual journey, the spiritual path. And the only thing that reviewer got wrong was, I think Andrew is one of the greatest adepts on the face of the planet right now. I feel very honored to be his friend.
Oh, I can tell that you obviously revere him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very lucky.
And
yeah.
I mispronounced his name because I've got the date of the book sitting without a space. So the one looks like an I, which is why I said Bozic. Book was published in 1990. So what are we looking at? 30 years ago.
Yeah, there's also a 25th anniversary edition published about 5 years ago. So it's updated 5 years ago. Love is a Secret. But he introduced me to the whole idea, Andrew Bozic introduced me to the whole idea of your relationship with God, with spirit, with your higher power, with the universe, whatever you call it. The name doesn't matter. But mystics describe the state of union with that higher state. And in my books, I tend to call it non-local mind, which is a kind of an agnostic, neutral term, non-religious term. But he talks about that as being as passionate as a love affair with a partner. And so when I was 20 years old and 30 years old, I was all about, hot sex and hot relationship chemistry. In my books, I now talk about chemistry as being pretty dysfunctional. In fact, the founder of the field of family therapy defined a marriage rather gloomily. Virginia Satir said, a marriage is two sets of dysfunctional family patterns attempting to come together to perpetuate themselves into the next generation. This is the founder of the field of marriage and family therapy, Virginia Satir, said that. So she had a very dim view of human ability to change. But so we're looking for, the hot lover, the chemistry. And what I show in Bliss Brain is that you get that chemistry when you're in love with the universe. When you close your eyes and enter these deep states, you ascend up the vibrational scale, the emotional scale. You enter these ecstatic states in which drugs, in which molecules like serotonin and dopamine are being created in your brain. Your brain's flooded with serotonin, which essentially is psilocybin. Magic mushrooms is simply synthetic serotonin. And so you're getting all this. THC is just, which is the active ingredient in marijuana, is just synthetic anandamide. And you make anandamide, you make serotonin, you make the same ingredients as found in ayahuasca in your brain in these deep states. And Andrew shows you that passion that you feel in meditation, in Love is a Secret, in this gorgeous book, he shows how that passion brings you into the state of love for what's greater than yourself. And mystics describe this ecstasy they move into. When they move into that ecstasy, they then move back into their bodies after meditation, and that's when the world around them is transformed. So Andrew really helped me understand how the passion of the beloved that we're thinking of and projecting onto that other person that we think will awaken this in us and kindle this in us is really just a misplaced version of what we're truly seeking from the divine, from the universe, from the infinite.
Wow. Yes, I'll have some of that, please. So number 10, How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain by Andrew Newberg and Mark Robert Waldman, published in 2016. And they are the best-selling authors of How God Changes Your Brain. So, obviously we can tell from what you do, as well as the books that you've chosen, how much you love where science comes together and, you know, gives us all the proof we need about love, about, you know, spiritual union, etc.
Yeah. And this is another book that's extremely well written. I just love the care that Andrew Newberg put into writing the book, and I really respect his research. And he began to use MRI scans in the mid-1990s and look at what was going on in the brains of meditators and finding changes. Now, the big news here is moving from states to traits. If I have a state of ecstasy, if I have a state of happiness, if I have a state that is stable, then that feels good. But if I have a trait of happiness, then nothing can take that away. So he writes about how our brains, initially we experience these states, and then after a while they become hardwired traits in our brains. And the other book that does this really well is a book called Altered Traits, which is
Daniel Goleman, yeah.
Daniel Goleman, yeah,
Mm.
and Richard Davidson. Those two books go together really well. Again, that's also a beautifully written book, full of examples of people who did this. And these are ordinary people. You don't have to be a monk. And the good news, I mean, what I talk about in my book Bliss Brain is that if you look back in history, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, you couldn't reach enlightenment. You couldn't reach these ecstatic states usually if you were in the world, if you were stuck in your profession, if you were stuck in your village. You had to go to the convent or the monastery or the desert or the place high up in the Himalayas. The West, the mystic fathers of the West went away. The nuns went into nunneries and convents. And so there were all these ways people got out of the world to experience enlightenment. And that was the old model. What Andrew Newberg shows us here is that now the new model is we can experience enlightenment as the school teacher, as the fireman, as the garbage collector, as the accountant. In every single profession, we no longer have to go away and spend 10,000 hours. And I want to say proudly about science, and this might seem maybe get me into trouble with some people, but we have reverse engineered meditation. We've studied these people who've spent 10,000 lifetime hours in meditation. Some of the people were in those two books, they've spent 60,000 hours, total lifetime hours in meditation. And so they've done a lot of it. We've studied their brains. And with the information, that's why I wrote Bliss Brain. I'm passionate about showing people how it doesn't have to take 10,000 hours. You don't have to go on a 3-year retreat. Like Graham Phillips, the guy in Mind to Matter, in 8 weeks, we're seeing massive structural changes in the brain. Keep on doing those for a year. You have start of a whole different brain. Your brain is firing differently. That means it's wiring differently. So Andrew Newberg's book, and also Altered Traits by Goleman and Davidson, they show this whole movement of us moving into hardwiring these states. So we're now resilient people, we're actually happy people, not just having temporary states of happiness.
Yeah, I love the way the brain research has come on to the point now where we understand, you know, like epigenetics, we are not at the mercy of our genes. We are not at the mercy of our conditioning. We are not at the mercy of all of the things that we thought we were growing up. We can change it. And the evidence is there. One of the things I love about your work is I know you've done so much work with people suffering from PTSD. And it's been, you know, phenomenal results. Would you like to just say a little bit about that? Because I think that really is a gift.
Yeah, so in 2007, I started a project called the Veteran Stress Project. I have an umbrella nonprofit called the National Institute for Integrative Healthcare. And our biggest single project is called the Veteran Stress Project. And so we work with veterans, we get them 6 free sessions of EFT, trials of EFT, several of them with veterans, and they show that in just 6 sessions, that these poor people who have high levels of flashbacks and nightmares and intrusive thoughts and hypervigilance and avoidance and all of these symptoms that are just having a massive impact on their lives, those symptoms just go away. And I've now worked with many veterans myself. Our volunteers have worked with over 20,000 veterans in the last 12 years. And we have done these trials, and they show that EFT is really effective for PTSD. So seeing a veteran, for example, one wife of one veteran after one of our retreats said, I finally got my Jimmy back. And when my Jimmy went to Vietnam, I lost him. He never really came back. He's always been in Vietnam in his head. And now since he's been through your program, I got my Jimmy back. He's back in my life. He's no longer yelling, no longer having these flashbacks, he's no longer drinking till he falls asleep in a stupor at night. Just all these good things happening. And so we have lots of those veteran success stories at the Veteran Stress Project. So I'm looking for ways to apply all this stuff. I mean, it's fine to have all this theory and ivory tower knowledge, which I present in my books, but then how do you get this into your family so your kid benefits? And how do you deal with your parent who's aging and has Alzheimer's or Parkinson's? How do you apply it there? If you're a veteran, how do you not get PTSD? Because about 2/3 of veterans who come back from the wars do not get PTSD. They're resilient. What's the difference between the ones who don't get PTSD and those that do? How do you deal with your own problems? Like when I have a chapter at the end of my book, Bliss Brain, on post-traumatic growth. And the publisher, when they were looking at the plan of the book, structure of the book, said, well, it's great you're showing how Bliss Brain ultimately leads to resilience, the ability to handle problems. They said, Dawson, we want you to tell your own story of post-traumatic growth, and we want you to tell it as chapter 1 of Bliss Brain. And I was like, well, I don't talk about myself in my books that much, and but I did. So in chapter 1 of Bliss Brain, I talk about a fire in Northern California where I live called the Tubbs Fire in October 2017, where we woke up, my wife and I woke up at 12:45 a.m. There was a wildfire racing toward our house. We grabbed our car keys and phones, sprinted for the car, and drove out through the flames. And our house, we got photographs the next day from a friend who got in past the National Guard and took pictures. And it was just the cement slab, the chimney, and ash. That was all that was left of the house. And our office building was on the same property. So the office was like that as well. So I tell my own story in chapter 1 of Bliss Brain. And I can tell you that, we didn't get PTSD. Now, I needed a lot of therapy after that. I needed tapping, I needed meditation, I needed all my own tools. So David Feinstein worked with us, our author friend of ours. Other practitioners, our certified practitioners, worked with us and helped us deal with the terrible memories of things we lost and just the nightmare of getting out of there. And the 22 people who died in the fire, that particular fire, 8 of them were within 1,000 yards of our home, because the fire moved so quickly. People died in their beds, they died in their cars. It was terrible. So it's not like we're Mr. Spock and we just go through this and we're all happy all the time. But we have to deal with the emotions, but you deal with them. You become a resilient person. So these books wind up being not just how you feel better, but once you've done this brain remodeling, you can deal with the fire. We dealt with the fire and we felt stronger afterwards, more resilient. We've dealt with the fire now. Someone was saying, well, here's the financial crash and it's the pandemic, and you guys are so happy, and saying, hey, sister, after you've been through the fire,
Yeah, I remember talking to you then. You had just experienced it. We were about to do an interview, and I was just shocked that you were still willing to do the interview. I thought you would be on your knees after something like that. So, yeah, great testament. Great testament. So, Bliss Brain is coming out later this year, yes?
September 16th is when the publication date is. We'll be doing I'm doing a lot of shows before Bliss Brain, a lot of shows after Bliss Brain. And Sandra, I want to see 1 million people get the information in that book. We've had over 100,000 so far who have got the information in mind to matter, and we've got so many emails from people. If you look at the reviews on Amazon too, we have close to 1,000 5-star reviews on Amazon for Mind to Matter. And the thing I love most about it is people say, I read Mind to Matter, and that finally convinced me to do what you do, Dawson, and meditate every day. I'm finally convinced of the science. I am now meditating every day. I talked to one lady at a live workshop, and she said, I read Mind to Matter, and I said, I'm going to meditate every day for the next 30 days. So I said to her, and what day are you on now? She said, oh, I'm on day 93 of 30. She just couldn't stop. And so that's what I want to do. I want to inspire people to apply these techniques like EFT tapping and meditation in their lives, and write those reviews on Amazon and tell people that these books are fantastic, and to go ahead and use these techniques. So the new book comes out in September, and I'm so happy that it's been 100,000 for Mind to Matter, and that those people's lives are changing the way my life changed. I want that to be a drop in the bucket, and I want to see 1 million people inspired to use these self-help techniques and shift their lives with Bliss Brain.
Well, I think as you've demonstrated tonight, talking about, many of the books here, that all of this is available to us, and it's simple and it's very, very profound. And whether it's about money or whether it's about something else entirely, we have access to all of this, and we have that access very, very cheaply. I mean, it's an amazing world where we can access all of this for just a few dollars. You don't have to go to school to do it.
It is, and we have all this information available to us on the web. And you can look through that information. You can sift through what is scientific and what's not. Yeah. I'm also working on a piece now about how to distinguish people who are real scientists from people who are science deniers. Because a lot of science deniers present themselves as scientists. For example, on Wikipedia. Wikipedia was taken over around 2004, 2005 by an organized group of skeptics who removed the articles on things like homeopathy, on energy medicine, on chiropractic, on energy psychology, and wrote their own articles calling these things pseudoscience. And then when they were hauled before the arbitration committee a few times for science denial and not letting science be on those pages, are total misinformation on Wikipedia, the science denial all over Wikipedia. You won't go on there and find a bad story about a prescription drug, for example.
No, exactly.
Because the drug companies are in there. There are big political actors. There are big political funds who are funding the editing of Wikipedia to reflect their political views. So there's a lot of science denial out there. Of course, there was a lot of climate change denial in the 1990s that stopped us from going on climate change as a species for 10 years. We did nothing about climate change in the 1990s, even though the evidence was there because of science denial. Now there's science denial around the pandemic, the science denial around the economy. And so you need to just be one information so people get a perspective on this is actual hard, good science. This over here is not. Like this one right now I'm really interested in is 5G. I don't know what the truth is about that, but there's all this kind of stuff. I'm being asked these questions about 5G. My answer is, I don't know. I don't know. I don't have to just go read the science, and that'll tell you. I can tell you that I don't know about 5G. I know a lot about fear and cortisol, and just it's fear that I'm much more focused on helping to avoid.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, stay out of the fear. Okay, so out of your 10 books, I know you said earlier that you wish you'd had Success Principles, and you've given that book to many people. But is that the book that you would choose above all of the others to give to someone who is stepping out onto their life journey?
I think so. It's the most succinct. It's because it's so many short chapters. and because it covers so many different topics. I think it's a really good summary, yes.
Okay. All right. One last question for you, Dawson, before we see if we've got any from our viewers. And that is, we like to ask all of our contributors so we can put on the page where we put their 10 best list, give us a few keywords or phrases that best describe you. Now, obviously, there are the, science writer, author, etc. But what I'm looking for are the ones that give us a real insight into who Dawson Church really is, sort of things your friends know about you. Tree hugger, cupcake connoisseur.
Well, I think one thing I can say is I'm really happy. I'm just a genuinely happy person. I wake up happy in the morning. I meditate in the morning, I get even happier. And again, if you told me when I was 15 I would one day be saying I'm happy, I would have said, you've got the wrong man. So I'm really happy. And yeah.
Can we call you
really
Happy Monster or Happiness Advocate?
Happiness, yeah, happiness advocate, and then very interested in the mechanics of happiness, because happiness is not just something that falls out of the sky or a fixed trait. Now, some people are happier than others, for sure, in terms of a trait, but you can change a lot in terms of your happiness. So being able to tune into that great non-local mind and then channel that into your life makes you much, much, much happier. So the how of happiness is that. And I think I'm very interested in showing people how to do it. I mean, I read through literally hundreds of scientific papers to write Bliss Brain, and I wanted to give people a very succinct way in eco-meditation. We've now had, I think we're getting something like 30,000 hits a month on ecomeditation.com, because I give away the instructions there for free. And so you go to eco-meditation, you download the instructions, you try them. People have written testimonials. I just went to the website. I went there, I sat down, I tried the 7 steps, and suddenly I can meditate for the first time in my life. So I'm very interested in sharing the tools of that. So being happy myself, but sharing not just theory, but how you can do it. So I think those are the things. I think I'm also very into the physical body and the physical world. I love food. I love wine. I love cars. I had a whole collection of British sports cars when I was before the fire. They all went up and they all became molten aluminum. But I haven't really bought any new ones. But I love that. I love money. I love the power money gives you to do things. Like people donate to my nonprofit, and then I use that money to treat veterans and to do research and stuff like that. So money gives me power to do global change. People pay for our workshops and our online training and getting certified. That gives us the money to offer those things. So I really, Sandra, I think the world, and I predict this at the end of Bliss Brain. I'm writing a new book as well, which I won't tell you about now because it's a whole different topic. But I think the world, I think we're on the cusp of the greatest social change in history, exponentially, and it's good. It's seriously good, and we're right there at that cusp right now. So I love money and influence because they are how we change people's minds, how we convince them to give themselves that moment of self-compassion, to take a deep breath, to give themselves some self-love and self-care, that set their alarm clock earlier and meditate. And so influence, money, time, energy, influence, to really have an impact on people's lives so that they can then change their own lives for the better.
Everybody is looking at, I say everybody, I'm talking about authorities, are looking at vaccinations for COVID. It strikes me we already have one. And it is happiness. It is happiness, because if you're happy, then you're creating all these wonderful hormones in your body, and there is no fear there. There's no room for fear. So I think we need to start a new virus, the happiness virus.
I wrote a blog post about where we are now. It's called The Pandemic of Compassion. And I looked at all of the good things people are doing for their neighbors, their friends, people around them. Just look at Pandemic of Compassion. I think I may have even bought the domain name and directed it there. But we're in a pandemic of compassion happening right now all over the world, that's bursting out. And it is seriously good for your health. In one of my studies, I looked at people doing meditation and tapping for a week at a retreat center, and their cortisol over that week dropped an average of 37%. Their stress hormones plummeted in a week. And when their stress hormones went down, their antibodies, we were also measuring antibodies in our lab, went up. And their antibodies went up by 113%. And these particular antibodies are little Y-shaped molecules called immunoglobulins, and there are several different flavors of them in the body. But the one we measured is in your saliva and your nose, and it's what is responsible for protecting you against viruses. And these Y-shaped immunoglobulin molecules, these antibodies, actually stick to the spikes on coronaviruses and immobilize them. So people's natural coronavirus neutralizing antibodies rose by 113% in 1 week of doing this stuff. That is, there's no drug that can do that for you.
No, speaks for itself, doesn't it? Absolutely. Dawson, I know we've gone over time. I'm very conscious that you have other things to do. We've had one message saying your inner joy and excitement is so palpable. Thank you for sharing your wonderful knowledge, wisdom, and experience. We have one quick question. I think perhaps you may have already answered it, from Jane, who says, what a fascinating session. Can you talk a bit about your writing process, especially how it connects to meditation? And I think you did say earlier that you meditate for 4 hours before you start writing.
Yeah, sometimes I meditate for a long time, more than 2 hours before I meditate, before I write. And so I get myself really, really calm and clear. And people say, well, how do you, and what David Feinstein, my older friend, says, he once introduced me as a keynote speaker at a conference saying, there's one body over there called Dawson Church, but actually it's 12 people. There's a committee there of 12 people, because it would take 12 people to do what he does. How can he be so productive? And the answer is that I'm guided by intuition. I'll sit down on my computer after 2 hours of meditation, and I'll open my email, and a colleague will have emailed me the exact study I need to write the chapter I'm writing that day. I have unbelievable synchronicities. In Mind to Matter, I talk about some of them that happened during the writing of the book, Mind to Matter. I'm writing a book about mind to matter, how our thoughts become material reality. And during the writing of the book, there were just all of these astonishingly unlikely synchronicities that happened to get the book written. So when you align yourself with the universal mind, when you align your local mind, in Mind to Matter, I talk about your local mind in the first chapter and the last chapter, and then aligning it with non-local mind, you then have access to all the wisdom of the universe. You have all of this insight and creativity. And so you then are channeling that down into your daily life. And you then are far more productive. In Bliss Brain, I have studies I talk about showing that people who are in this flow state of tuning into non-local mind and channeling non-local information into local mind, people in that flow state are 5 times as productive as people who aren't. They have more than 4 times the ability to solve complex problems, and they're more than twice as creative as people not in flow. So that's that writing process. You tune into non-local mind. And I tell people in my live workshops, I say, the vision of you and your life, that non-local mind and the universe, this wonderful benevolent universe we live in, the view of the version of you held in the mind of the universe is so much greater than the version of you held in your local mind, and certainly in the mind of your ancestry and your past traumas. So you want to tune into that non-local mind, download that information to your local mind, and then live a life where you are just overflowing with the inspiration and love and joy and creativity that brings. So that's my writing process.
Dawson, thank you. We've got a note from Jen who says, thank you so much. I deeply appreciate hearing about your journey and how your mission is to share your knowledge and live by example. And somebody else, Jane, whose question you answered, said, you're my synchronicity for the day. I can't think of a better note to end it on. Dawson Church, thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your sharing.
Thank you for sharing.
Okay, everybody, if you want to know more about Dawson, experience more of his work, you can visit his many websites, dawsonchurch.com, yourgeniusgene.com, mindtomatter.com, blissbrain.com, and niih.org. Thank you, Dawson Church. Thank you to everybody for joining us today. Till the next time.